What's going on, guys? Hope this video finds you well. So, it is time for me to discuss my thoughts on Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, thanks to the PC port that came out this past January. For full disclosure, I did pre-purchase this. For one, because this game was a guaranteed play for me one way or the other, and for two, there was a nice 30% pre-purchase discount as well. And due to those extra savings, I opted to grab the Digital Deluxe Edition, since it was cheaper than what I would have spent on the base game had that been at full price. Ultimately, though, I kind of wish I had saved the extra 15 or 20 bucks or whatever it was, since I found the deluxe content to not particularly be worth it. The extra equipment and summons became quickly inconsequential to my playthrough. So if I could go back and just buy the base game at 30% off, I probably would do that, but it's not really a huge deal at this point. I did previously do a video discussing Final Fantasy VII Remake. That video is a few years old at this point, but until I get a chance to replay Remake and kind of reevaluate my thoughts on it, I think that it's still a good encapsulation of how I feel about it as of the release of this video. As far as my general thoughts on FF7 Rebirth before digging into the details, I overall greatly enjoyed my time with this game, despite this portion of the trilogy adapting what I would deem to be probably the least interesting part of the original game. I spent about 80 hours with it while being pretty damn thorough. I haven't done absolutely everything as far as side content is concerned, but I did a hefty chunk of it as I was playing through the main story. Playing it like that, along with some other factors, created what I would deem to be somewhat similar issues that I have with the original FF7, in particular this chunk that Rebirth is adapting, but through different means, while simultaneously improving on certain aspects that were lacking for me in the original, along with some narrative skepticism thrown in for good measure. For those of you who are able and interested in showing additional support towards me in the channel, since this is a one-man operation, I do have a Ko-fi page for direct donations, as well as the myriad ways to show support through YouTube. Thank you to those who have shown support thus far, and thank you to everyone else for your consideration. As far as the presentation is concerned, a lot of what I had to say about Remake still applies here. The game looks great, the music is still phenomenal. The main difference, I would say, with Rebirth is in the tone, because instead of taking place in the grungy mechanical city of Midgar, Rebirth adapts the portion of the original Final Fantasy VII in which the player is introduced to the various locales throughout the world, and the connections certain characters in the party have to said locales as well, while ultimately being what I would deem a very slow and at times aimless pursuit of Sephiroth in an attempt to stop whatever he might be planning. This contributes to a certain level of coziness that I felt throughout the bulk of this game that wasn't as present in Remake, but I think that's intentional just due to the difference in locales and what the party's goals are. That's not to say that this game doesn't have its fair share of serious moments, and I'd say it largely succeeds in pivoting towards more of that tone when it needs to, but if you are going out of your way to participate in the more open, exploratory aspects to Rebirth, I think a greater percentage of your time with it will end up being in that cozier sort of feel. I was initially very impressed at how well the groundwork laid in Remake was adapted to something more open. And I think to an extent this was necessary for the sake of portraying the scope of this world. I don't think it would have necessarily worked if this game was exactly structured like Remake, though that would admittedly have lent this game more consistent pacing, contrary to how Remake's pacing suffers, which was primarily through mandatory meandering, a noticeable culprit of which was the shimmying segments where you would have to squeeze between a wall or crawl under a gap as the game loaded the next area in order to appear seamless. Thankfully, that is much less the case in Rebirth. For the most part, it's able to disguise the loading much more naturally, due in no small part to the fact that this game was developed primarily for the PlayStation 5, which of course has a solid state drive built into it. Most of Rebirth's pacing issues come down to the player's willingness and decision to participate in the open world checklisty kinds of stuff. Because as someone who did all of the open world checklisty kinds of stuff as I went through each of these areas, I would say that there is too much. Each individual activity is inoffensive enough, I suppose, but the way that these ultimately mundane and repetitive activities drag in little ways was what got on my nerves after a while. Not only do you have to do the thing, a little stock animation will play, Chadley talks for sometimes upwards of a minute, the little jingle has to play, the little dot has to fill in, your points go up, then there's the little splash where it says task complete or whatever, and then you can move. Going through this process dozens and dozens of times throughout the game is, I think, what mostly contributes to the tedium. Something as simple as just letting the player move during all of that, I think that would be so much nicer than just simply having to stand there and wait through this stuff, especially when there are segments where Chadley will talk to you while you can still move. And this isn't even really a slight on Chadley per se. I actually kind of grew to like Chadley as a character in this game. He just suffers from ultimately being a tutorial and lore dump character that turns the pace of what should be quick and easy activities into a chore. Thankfully, this game does structurally break up these open open area segments with more linear dungeon type areas, which I think was what allowed me to tolerate doing all the open worldy kinds of stuff for the first several areas before it started to get on my nerves. At the point that it started to get on my nerves was when they kind of throw you into two of them back to back, more or less. There was a chapter late on in the game which added a handful more side quests on top of what was previously available, in addition to opening up the fast travel options with what seems to be the intent of giving the player a chance to fully explore one last time before the point of no return. And thankfully, this point is very easy to return to once you beat the game thanks to the chapter select feature. My personal recommendation for those who haven't played Rebirth and are looking to at some point in the future is that you do the proto relic quests as they become available to you, maybe doing some of the other stuff on the way if you want, but I would highly recommend saving the rest of it for post-game cleanup if that's something that you decide to do. Technically, there are benefits from completing these things in various ways, in particular the various materia that you can purchase from Chadley with points that you're acquiring from doing these tasks. So maybe if there's a particular materia that you're curious about or want to acquire, you could do just enough to do that and then save the rest for later. It has been a few years since I played through Remake, but I remember those side quests being pretty underwhelming, and I would say largely skippable unless you're trying to do everything in that game. And I think Rebirth handles the side quests better than Remake did, primarily because Rebirth side quests not only focus on Cloud's involvement, but also highlighting a particular party member that may be relevant due to either the location that they're in, the task that is being requested of you, and even at times certain ideals that characters hold. Whether it be something that's relevant to those ideals or something that's challenging those ideals, it provides some nice little character moments that are much appreciated, especially considering the original game, in my opinion, lacking in those smaller character moments, in particular for characters that weren't in your active party at the time. And that's something that I haven't mentioned yet, is that the party members that aren't in your active party are still there for story moments, and they're even in combat to a supplemental degree. Now, as far as the mini games are concerned, the original Final Fantasy VII is kind of known for its integration of little one-off mini games throughout the main story and otherwise, be it performing CPR, dolphin jumping, playing arcade games and whatnot at the Gold Saucer, etc. and so on. And Rebirth really takes that stereotype of Final Fantasy VII and kind of runs with it to an extreme that I could see off-putting certain players. Even if some of them were a little tedious or annoying at times, they were usually over before that became much of a problem. Now, if you are trying to grind out getting the highest rank or a perfect score on these, then yeah, I could totally see that being frustrating. And I felt that some, but it's not really something that I feel particularly committed to. If it becomes too much of a chore, I'm just like not gonna do it. I guess with the main exception of that being Queen's Blood, which is Final Fantasy VII's card game minigame. Think, of course, Triple Triad from Final Fantasy VIII, or Tetramaster from Final Fantasy IX, or even a more recent Western example, Gwent from The Witcher 3. There's even a tournament you can participate in during the main story, and a bunch of different opponents and challenges to do throughout the world. I like these kinds of deck building games. Not everyone that I've played has clicked with me necessarily, but it's a style of game that I do enjoy in short bursts. However, I did begin to get frustrated with Queen's Blood as new cards got introduced that kind of could break the conventions of how I thought the game worked. It just kind of became a little more trial and error-y for my like, and I know that in a turn-based game that can just be how things play out generally. I think it's mainly because I got accustomed to playing a certain way, with locking my opponent out of panels and then just kind of automatically winning from there, to the point when these more complicated cards with different effects came into play, it was really hard to predict and even at times play around what was going to happen before it actually happened. Not the biggest deal, like there hasn't been a Queen's Blood match that I wasn't able to eventually beat. This is still, in my mind, a great hybrid between action and command-based combat. Each character plays differently enough from one another in the action context, while still retaining the flexibility that materia provides, and while you're using these standard attacks in an action context, you're filling up your ATB meter, which then allows you to perform and issue commands to your various party members. And the intent is to kind of juggle between these two aspects, which I found can be tricky to do at times, but in a way that feels like I can still improve at playing this game as opposed to something that feels completely unmanageable. I think that there is somewhat of a learning curve behind this combat system. I think it takes a lot of concentration and practice to an extent to nail the action components while also paying mind to your ATB and not letting that go to waste. This leads to a combat system where when it finally clicks, it feels amazing when you nail an encounter and especially a boss fight. A complaint that I had with the remake that is at least somewhat remedied here is that your other two party members that aren't being controlled by you will sometimes just stand there and not really take advantage advantage of the fact that they can just use regular attacks. In those instances, I'll usually issue a command with the character I'm currently playing as and then swap to one of them to start doing standard attacks to build up their ATB. Something I failed to mention in that remake video from a few years back is the pressure and stagger mechanics here. Every enemy and boss in this remake trilogy thus far has a stagger meter as well as their health bar. As you're attacking these various enemies and bosses, you will not only be dealing damage to their HP meter, but also building up this stagger meter, which once it's full, incapacitates them temporarily and allows you to deal extra damage to them while they're in this staggered state. Certain attacks and abilities will deal more stagger than others. This is especially important when it comes to pressuring enemies, which will typically be done through exploiting their elemental weakness, but there are a number of enemies and bosses that get pressured through other means, like dodging or countering certain attacks, for instance. And these are all things that are detailed when using the assess materia, which I would highly recommend equipping to whoever is the party leader at the time, so that way you can see this information and also have access to it for later encounters with said enemy. And what pressuring enemies does puts them in a state where the stagger meter will increase far more than usual. So it's usually best to try to pressure enemies as effectively as possible in order to build up their stagger meter, in order to incapacitate them, in order to deal more damage than you otherwise would be doing. A major addition was made to the combat here, being synergy skills and synergy abilities. While holding the guard button in combat, you can activate either offensive or defensive synergy skills with the face buttons, which vary depending on who the other characters in your active party are. It was tricky for me, at least, to determine when I would want to use synergy skills versus regular attacks. Of course, if the character you're trying to use a synergy skill with is incapacitated, then it won't trigger, so like that's something to consider, I suppose. Or if they're in the middle of another action, it'll take them a second to activate. In addition to these synergy skills, you have synergy abilities, and how these work is that you build your synergy gauge by using actions that cost ATB. And these various synergy abilities require each of the characters involved in said synergy ability to have their synergy gauge filled to a certain point, which is indicated by individual rectangles. So it's less like a single meter and it's more like charges that build up, and you spend a certain number of those charges to execute these synergy abilities. And not only do they often deal a lot of damage, but they can have bonus effects like reducing MP cost to 0 for both characters for a time, or dealing increased damage to enemies that are staggered. There's ones that allow both characters to have 3 charges of ATB they can build up at once. Now, the unfortunate thing when it comes to these synergy abilities and even limit breaks to an extent is that because your AI party members are not the most useful, it's unfortunately kind of inefficient for you to sit and watch these beautiful animations play out when you do these powerful attacks, because you're better off jumping to a character who's not participating and using regular attacks to build up their ATB. I wouldn't want combat to completely halt, obviously, but it would be nice if the other party members were constantly attacking when they can, so that I could actually watch and enjoy these bombastic animations from the synergy abilities and limit breaks. And sometimes I would, just for the sake of it, but it's really hard to justify doing that when the other party members that aren't participating in said attack are just kind of like standing there. At the very least, during said circumstances, it'd be nice if the other party members would ramp up their use of standard attacks, even if the developers don't want to have them doing that all the time for the sake of not making the player too powerful. But even then, I feel like it's something that you could definitely balance around by either lowering the rate at which ATB fills up, or even like reducing the amount of damage that they do with standard attacks when not controlled by the player. I don't know. There's any number of things that could balance a version of these games in which your other party members don't just stand around basically doing nothing without your input. I'm still learning things about this combat system. I'm still kind of honing my skill at it. There's definitely been a lot of encounters and bosses and stuff like that where either I'm just kind of feeling lazy and not really paying too much attention, or there's just a lot going on, and so I miss certain things, or I'm not able to kind of parse the information as quickly as I would like to. And that was kind of an issue that I took with the remake in particular, was the readability of enemy attacks and all of that. But I don't know if it's because Rebirth changed or improved this, or if it's because of my past experience with remake, but I felt like I was able to manage a lot better in Rebirth than I did in remake. I don't think this game on normal is particularly difficult to get through, but for me at least, it's more so about trying to play well, which is where the challenge sort of comes into play on normal mode. There's also an adaptive difficulty setting which scales enemies to your level, which could be potentially great for a pseudo New Game Plus run, in which I guess you would just chapter select back to chapter 1 and play with your existing materia setups, but without simply steamrolling through everything. And then of course on top of this you have hard mode, which can only, as far as I know, be initiated through chapter select, because it's really a mode that is intended to be played with endgame setups in mind, primarily because, as far as I understand, you can't use items at all, either outside of battle or in battle, which then would require you to heal and restore status through spells. And because MP is fairly limited, in addition to certain spells being really expensive to cast, makes MP a resource that you really need to managed more thoroughly, because the only way to restore it in hard mode is by resting at benches that are periodically found throughout the game. I don't necessarily think that it needs to be mentioned, but of course the materia system is just as flexible and interesting as it's always been, just, you know, within the framework of what I would deem to be a much more interesting and dynamic combat system. Not that there isn't room for improvement or innovation or evolution on this combat system, but just looking at the core of how this combat system operates, it's something that I think feels very unique and is something that I would really like to see in other games, be it Final Fantasy or otherwise. As far as brief spoiler-free thoughts, I thought that the story beats from the original that were fleshed out in Rebirth were often done in a way that enhanced them for me, primarily thanks to the way that the characters are characterized in this remake trilogy so far, in addition to taking more time with certain story moments, and even adding some new stuff here and there. Now, these new story moments that were added in between moments that were already in the original were the moments that sort of built up a level of skepticism that I had with the direction that this trilogy is taking, but still not to the point where I've completely written off what they're doing here. And I think that's the extent in which I can discuss this game's story spoiler-free without just giving a really boilerplate description of this game's story. So this is going to be your spoiler warning for not only Final Fantasy VII Remake and Rebirth, but also the original game, since there's certain things that will no doubt be covered in part 3, but I kind of like have to talk about them in order to give my full impressions of certain aspects. Now, the game, of course, opens with the prologue of you playing as Zack in a reality where Avalanche failed and I guess mostly died, aside from Cloud and Aerith, who are hanging on by a thread, it seems. The Zack segments, whenever they came up, were something that had me raising an eyebrow through most of the game's runtime. Ultimately, I feel like I kinda could have done without them, but I understand that it's sort of necessary within the framework, at least, of the story that this trilogy is trying to tell. I thought the Kalm flashback was handled really well. I think that Cloud's behavior during this segment is very indicative of the truth behind that whole scenario. I find it kind of interesting that characters in-game, but also in real life when discussing Final Fantasy VII, will sometimes talk about how similar Cloud is to Zack before his memories are restored properly. I just don't really buy that, because I don't really think Cloud acts like Zack very much at all outside of this flashback. Sure, Cloud has like a certain air of confidence that he definitely didn't have prior to Zack's death, but his personality like really couldn't be more different from Zack, I feel like, aside from the surface level similarities, I guess. Moving on from that though, I did like that Kalm actually had a bit of a scenario going on as opposed to just doing the flashback and bailing. Throughout the Grasslands, there's really like not a ton that happens. You know, you go to the Chocobo Ranch, you fight the Midgard Sormer, you make your way to the Mythril Mine, which is kind of the first aforementioned linear dungeon segment in between the open areas to kind of break things up pacing wise. And you know, while not the most interesting dungeon crawling per se, as a pace breaker, I actually much appreciated it. And honestly kind of found myself looking forward to these types of segments more so than looking forward to more open world kind of shit. You encounter the Turks, the party gets split up. I do like the way that different party setups are integrated here. It's not unlike how Remake handles things throughout pretty much the entirety of that game's runtime, but here it's mostly relegated to these linear dungeon-like segments. Now, once you get to Junon area, this is the one where I think it almost makes the least sense to do all of the open world stuff if you're trying to consider what Cloud and company are trying to do. And this is primarily because the Mythril Mine spits you out at a point where you're really close to Junon, or I guess under Junon in this case, which is how you would progress the main story, and yet you can go the complete opposite direction, which is where the majority of the open world kind of shit is in the Junon area. I guess one way you could do it is go to under Junon, play up until the point where you gain access to the side quests there, and then go do the side quests out in Junon area, like going to the Crow's Nest and all of that kind of stuff. I think back on it and I kind of question like why there was so much to do here when Cloud and company just don't really have much of a reason to dawdle. I mentioned that usually there's a linear dungeon kind of segment to break up these open areas, and I really actually like that Junon sort of serves as the dungeon, quote unquote, here. And it's a very different kind of dungeon. There's still combat, of course, especially once all hell breaks loose after the parade, but just kind of, you know, wandering Junon as a city and recruiting different segments of the battalion or whatever to perform this parade, I thought was quite enjoyable. I mean, it took me a while to find the last one that I was missing for whatever reason, but you could almost sort of view the parade as being sort of like the boss for the Junon chapter, even though there is an actual boss. Speaking of which, something I didn't mention with Remake in that video those years back is that I really don't like Roach as a character, like, at all.
Oh, the jackass with the bike? He's... A jackass.
He was inoffensive enough in Remake because he shows up for that one chapter with Jesse and then doesn't show up again for the rest of that game. I guess he pops up to play Fort Condor against in the Yuffie DLC. Roach is just much more prevalent here. Like, you fight him a few different times in different circumstances, and I just find his personality to be kind of grating. I mean, at least this particular fight in Junon is quite enjoyable, but I'm kind of glad that he's now out of the picture for the sake of part 3. I was also quite impressed by how a lot of the boss fights adapt the mechanics that were in the original game into this remake combat structure, like how the Terror of the Deep still captures your party members in bubbles that you have to break with magic. All of the character party interactions in the hotel in Under Junon I really liked, especially between Cloud and Tifa. As much as I personally prefer a character like Aerith, it's like so clear that because of Cloud and Tifa's history and how they grow closer throughout the duration of, you know, the original game, of course, and even this trilogy, like, it just makes sense for Cloud to end up with Tifa in the end. But because the player is given agency over who they bond with more, which, you know, then determines who you go out with at the Gold Saucer, I, as the player, opted to pursue Aerith primarily. So that's kind of my stance on that. Not really worth getting too worked up over, in my opinion. Rufus was actually willing to pardon Avalanche until Yuffie attempts to kill him, and then he assumes that Yuffie is with them, which she isn't at that time. I really did appreciate the integration of Yuffie into the main story, which of course Yuffie was an optional character in the original game, so they had to do something to have her be recruited officially. She tends to butt heads with some of the more level-headed and more mature members of the group, like Barrett, for instance, which provides some additional tension in the party, which is something I really like, even though I personally find Yuffie to kind of be annoying, but like that's kind of her personality, so it's good characterization that just doesn't necessarily mesh with what I would deem to be my favorite characters in fiction, but that's not really the important thing. I would much prefer that Yuffie's portrayal here be faithful to the character than for her to appeal to me personality-wise at the cost of not being herself, quote-unquote. And also, Yuffie is probably one of the most fun characters to play as in these remake games anyway, so we have the whole ship segment, which I absolutely loved. You've got the Queen's Blood tournament, which is technically optional. The way that the whole Genova ship takeover thing was adapted here, I thought was fantastic. This was finally actually the point in the game where I thought that the combat clicked for me again for the first time since playing Remake. And yeah, man, every time I get a chance to fight Genova in one of these games, I just have the dumbest smile on my face. I just really love Genova as an antagonist, and I can't wait to see more of that in part 3, of course. Now, landing in Costa del Sol, it kind of makes sense that because how slow and aimless the chase after Sephiroth is, that some of the party members want to take a break because it feels like they can't. And I guess technically they can, because it's not like Cloud has the black materia and is going off on his own to hand it over to Sephiroth. I mean, that's obviously the moment where the world actually becomes truly in danger in a more immediate sense. Do I think that the Costa del Sol segment needed to be as long as it was? Not necessarily, but I appreciated that there was more than just running into Hojo at the beach and then leaving. And I guess the Hojo segment is expanded a bit. I do think it's a little dumb how he's like, oh, I'm going to capture them, and this is totally going to work. As an excuse for Yuffie to join the squad, I guess it works okay, but there's also nothing saying that she couldn't have joined on the ship or something. Not really my favorite scenario. I think it's a little goofy and hammy and a little dumb, but that's also just Final Fantasy sometimes. The Gold Saucer was awesome. Loved how over the top it is. Loved how much there is to do there should you want to do everything. Loved the character moments. There's one particular interaction after like the whole bombastic opening show at the Gold Saucer, which of course shows that Cloud can actually have fun and like express that, which is cool. But when the girls are like going off to play arcade games and like explore the Gold Saucer and stuff, it's clear that part of Cloud wants to go and participate, but he's hesitant, and Barrett kind of taps him on the shoulder, and I think his exact words were like, come on man, this isn't your scene. Why don't you go help me check into the hotel? And like that particular interaction made me feel so seen in like such an interesting way. I don't necessarily need for characters in media that I participate in to be relatable in the traditional sense, but there are certainly aspects to Cloud's character that I can relate to, and it kind of had me evaluating the reasons why Cloud's character resonates with me so much. But again, I don't necessarily even need that, nor was I really looking for that. Ultimately, I'm just looking for quality characterization and character growth in general, whether or not it's relatable or not. Of course, here is where we meet Kate Sith, who I would say is like kind of a strange character, but one that I think is very charming. I think the Scottish accent helps kind of give him a little more personality, because Kate Sith honestly was a character in the original game that I didn't really like that much, but I think that not only the way his personality is represented here, but also the way in which his ultimate betrayal and redemption occurs, I just thought was much more effective. Of course, Cloud and the gang get roped into Barrett getting accused for killing a bunch of people in the Gold Saucer. They get sent to the Dust Bowl, which is the area underneath the saucer. Loved all this stuff, this sort of like seedy underbelly side of the glitz and glamour. Barrett confronts Dine, which I thought ultimately ultimately was quite effective, but I was a little off-put when Dine started like magnetizing bar parts and shit to his arm and swinging it around like a damn Dark Souls 3 boss. I think I would have preferred it if it was more of a straight up mirror match kind of thing, but I could also kind of see that maybe getting a little boring. Either way, ultimately I think it was effective. I just thought that stuff was a little distracting, I guess. Then you fight Palmer here instead of at Rocket Town because Rocket Town isn't even in Rebirth at all, which I suppose makes sense because Cid doesn't formally join the party in this game. So I could see that being saved for part 3 because you go back to Rocket Town during disc 2 of the original game anyway, as far as I'm recalling. And then there's like this weird on rails shooting segment, which I was talking about the mini games earlier, where most of them were like inoffensive enough to like not really be much of a problem for me, even the ones that I wasn't a big fan of, except for this one was like weirdly kind of shit. And I seem to remember there being a prompt to skip it, which I wonder if that was like patched in after the fact because players generally speaking thought it was shit. It just seemed like it was dragging for fucking ever, and I was like not really totally sure why. But yeah, that's like the one minigame standout that I can think of that I like genuinely disliked. The party clears Barrett's name and gets the Dust Bowl guy what he wants, and so Dio gifts them the truck. I will say I was pleasantly surprised at how Dio was adapted. Like he's still wearing a Speedo and shit. It's quite funny and goofy, but like in a way that's still believable for this world at least. I remember Gongaga in the original game being mostly optional from what I recall. You can pop in and talk to Zack's parents, and you can and maybe need to go to the reactor to overhear the Turks talking about where they're going next or something, but it's really like a short segment in the original that's kind of made into more of an ordeal. Gongaga is the jungle area for this game and can be quite actually difficult to maneuver around, which weirdly reflects a feeling that I had in the original FF7 at times, where you're trying to maneuver the pre-rendered backgrounds and figure out where you can and can't go. Of course, in most releases of the game at least, like there's a button you can press that'll show you entrances and exits, but sometimes getting there can be not as simple as you might think. It is kind of funny that that sort of confusion of maneuverability and getting around is kind of almost paid homage weirdly with the way that the mushrooms bounce you around in Gongaga. I feel like the city's just much more fleshed out. There's more to do, which I can appreciate. I think Cisne is an interesting character. I liked her, and there's definitely more to her that's going to be expounded on in part 3, which is cool. But yeah, the whole scenario with the Gongaga reactor, I guess is supposed to be this region's dungeon, so to speak, but it doesn't feel as fleshed out as like the Mythril Mine or Junon or the Gold Saucer. And once you're done with that segment and you go to Cosmo Canyon, it just feels like a lot of open world stuff with not enough linear dungeon type stuff to break it up. But that's also on the player to an extent, as far as how much you're going to participate in that and how you pace things. I'll explain in a second. So the Gongaga reactor segment, I just thought it was like a little too climactic for something that happens just like randomly in the middle of the game. In addition to that, I don't know if it's because I had Cloud equipped with this stupid purple dark sword looking thing, but I didn't quite buy into the scenario where he starts killing a bunch of people. Technically you're killing fiends and soldiers and stuff like that constantly, but they emphasize it with like blood splattering on his face in like these certain scenarios where Sephiroth takes over. There's that tension between him and Tifa where the Mako poisoning or Sephiroth or, you know, like some combination of the two is causing him to doubt that Tifa is the real Tifa. It was kind of a red herring in the marketing as far as like, is Tifa dead? And it's like, no. She falls into the life stream as kind of a foreshadowing for when in the original game in disc 2, she goes into the life stream to repair Cloud's memories and all of that. So I can appreciate this segment from that front, but I was still kind of skeptical because you have the two different types of whispers that are battling it out within the life stream. Even though I wasn't like totally sold on this whole segment of the game, the Gongaga reactor, Tifa in the life stream kind of stuff, it facilitated what I thought was a really poignant and one of my favorite moments between Cloud and Tifa thus far. Tifa falling in there and seeing the whispers fighting and seeing that the life stream is unstable in some way or in conflict or whatever is like a new, as far as I understand, motivation to go to Cosmo Canyon other than it's just on the way. And this is when we meet Cid for the first time, which is cool. I really like Cid as a character in the original game. He's definitely not as angry seemingly here. I'm just like curious if he's gonna act differently once he's back in Rocket Town, dealing with his past regrets and stuff like that. But yeah, Cid flies the gang over to Cosmo Canyon, at which point like you're given free reign to explore. I made the mistake of doing a lot of the open world stuff first. That back to back with a lot of the Gongaga stuff that I did after the reactor. That's where the fatigue really started to set in. But I wouldn't be surprised if some players felt it a lot sooner. I guess it helped that I was traveling for a few weeks in the middle of my playthrough, so I did the Gongaga reactor, took a few weeks off, and then when I came back, I did a lot of the open world stuff and proceeded to Cosmo Canyon and whatever. But yeah, Cosmo Canyon has an actual dungeon segment with Red 13 and Barrett, which I enjoyed. I mean, some of the enemies in there are a little annoying to deal with, but it's a nice little expansion on Red 13 or Nanaki as a character, ultimately leading to a similar place as the original with him discovering that his dad was a hero and not a coward. As far as my impressions of Red 13 / Nanaki as a character, I think it's actually kind of clever the way that he was disguising his voice prior to Cosmo Canyon in an attempt to be taken more seriously, since he has technically been around longer than maybe the entire rest of the party, even though of course by his lifespan standards he is still a teenager, so he still kind of has that childish whimsy, which you can see in moments like when you're doing the pirate's treasure quest, or even taking pictures for the children's book author, and I guess in retrospect him dressing up as a Shinra soldier for the Queen's Blood tournament, which of course also serves as a callback to the original game. But I do actually find it quite cute the way that he gets invested into these kinds of things. Although it's interesting, I don't remember the Gi being as fleshed out, but the fact that they want the black materia and the gang technically accepts that they're going to give it to them, it's just like kind of adding to the amount of factions that may participate in what is likely going to be full-out war in the third game. You go to Nibelheim, which I thought felt a lot more manageable as far as the open world stuff. It didn't seem like there was as much to do. It's like a smaller area. And the chocobo ability in Nibelheim also allows you to fly around in more of a direct way, which speeds up the process as well. What's most interesting and notable during this segment is that Cloud starts to remember things about Zack, whereas in the original game, I don't think he remembers jack shit until Tifa restores his memories in the live stream. Cloud is still clearly off his rocker, but he's remembering things. And so that's a difference that I think could be interesting going forward as his mental state continues to weaken. When you actually fight Galleon Beast Vincent, which is fucking sick. Do I even need to explain that Vincent is badass? Come on, this is like peak late 90s, early 2000s, edgy cool shit, and I fucking can't wait to play as Vincent and even Sid in part 3. That's gonna be awesome. Of course, in chapter 12, it opens up, as I mentioned previously, and you're given some more stuff to do, but really mostly an opportunity to clean up stuff you haven't done yet, which leads me to all the Gilgamesh stuff and the Final Fantasy V sort of fan service from that. As someone who really enjoyed playing through Final Fantasy V for the first time last year, I just really enjoyed all of the proto-relic Gilgamesh stuff. And as with most of the dungeony, more linear segments in this game, I really enjoyed the Temple of the Ancients. And you know, again, not the greatest of all time dungeon crawling or puzzling necessarily, but enjoyable and diverse enough to the point where I enjoyed the change of pace. Although it did get a little bit annoying being like, all right, you're playing as Cloud's party, and then now we're gonna skip back a few hours to see what Aerith's party was doing in the meantime, and then we would go back to Cloud's party and back and forth kind of thing. That was like a little bit weird pacing wise, but ultimately it worked out. We finally get to fight Sung, whereas we fought all the other members of the Turks previously. And I really like the Turks overall. I think they're interesting antagonists, like kind of a private security detail for Shinra. It's so cool and like obviously very unique for Final Fantasy, especially at the time of FF7's original release, but really just kind of in general. From what I'm recalling from the original, doesn't the temple shrink to become the black materia? Whereas it seems like the black materia that they picked up in the temple, in this case, is the actual black materia. Things play out like a little bit differently, but ultimately Cloud still freaks out and attacks Aerith, at which point she transports him at least mentally to the world where Zack is still alive. It seems like it's insinuated that Aerith, through the life stream, is able to connect to the different alternate timelines that are kind of at play here. Like in the remake timeline, her holy materia is empty, and so like doesn't actually have power, I'm assuming. Whereas she was, I guess, hiding the actual holy materia from Sephiroth in one of these alternate timelines via life stream manipulation shenanigans. While I do find like the whole multiverse trend in media these days to be tired and kind of annoying and not my preference when it comes to how stories are told, I tend to prefer stories that are told in kind of more of an isolated manner where they don't have to explicitly connect to something else or make an expanded universe or multiverse or whatever. And the way that Remake and Rebirth have handled this thus far has definitely been more confusing and convoluted than I think it needed to be, but I don't find the concept that this stuff is possible within the universe of FF7 to be that far-fetched, given that it's already been established that Aerith is able to manipulate things from within the lifestream after her death in the original, like warding off meteors so that way Holy can actually destroy it. And even beyond that, I haven't watched Advent Children, but from what little I've heard about that movie, it seems like Sephiroth is able to come back to some degree thanks to the way that the lifestream works. And it's also heavily implied that Sephiroth, as well as Aerith even, knows more than what they did in the original game's timeline. I actually wouldn't be surprised if it turns out that the Whispers are potentially spirits of some kind, either of people who have died and or they're being controlled by Aerith or Sephiroth, and of course each side fighting for a different outcome. Because I would guess if Meteor destroys the planet in any one of these timelines, you'd think the lifestream would cease to exist and it would end all of them, maybe? So Aerith is very clearly dead in the remake timeline. It is kind of a shame that we don't really get a chance to properly mourn because it's constantly flashing between a world where she is alive and a world where she dies. We don't actually get to see Cloud send her off in the water, although I could see that happening when Cloud's memories are restored and he's not delusional anymore. It is interesting that Cloud can still see her, but I wonder how much of that is actually Aerith like projecting herself specifically to Cloud because they connected in that other world, or if it's because Cloud is just completely fucking out of his mind at this point. I'm kind of hoping that part 3 ends up trimming a lot of the fat that Rebirth has present, because not only is there just so much more plot to cover as far as what's left to adapt from the original game story-wise, but also you have Yuffie and Vincent being mandatory party members, and therefore their backstories and like separate events that were optional in the original game are likely going to be mandatory. And this is without even mentioning that there might even be more new moments added to kind of flesh out this sort of meta-narrative that's going on, while simultaneously adapting what I would deem to be the best parts of the original game. First and foremost, it's like heading to the Northern Crater to track down Sephiroth, and then ultimately Cloud handing him the Black Materia and summoning Meteor. Then the party, I think, is captured and then has to frantically figure out how the fuck to stop Meteor, in which case you're kind of bouncing between locations you've been to earlier on in the original game, or in this case, in Rebirth. I'm also very curious to see how this war between Shinra and Wutai plays out. I didn't mention Lodbrok at all. I thought it was weird he was wearing black robes at like a press conference, but then it makes sense because it wasn't really him. But yeah, still just questions when it comes to that. I don't really have a definitive take on it just because it's not done yet. That leads to my ultimate hope for part 3 is that they're able to stick the landing. While each of these entries in the FF7 Remake trilogy are their own individual products, it still does feel somewhat preemptive to judge too many aspects of the narrative changes, especially until this trilogy is actually complete. Character and combat wise, I've much enjoyed these remakes over the original. Narratively, as far as the plot's concerned, is where many of my issues kind of arise. And from that front, the original game is much more consistent because, you know, it released prior to all these sequels and side games and movies that kind of made some changes and additions to the lore and whatnot that some people may or may not be the biggest fan of. And that extends to this remake trilogy thus far. I totally don't blame anyone for not being into what they're doing here. But at the same time, I've said it a million times, as with pretty much all video game remakes, as long as the original is accessible, it's hard for me to really take umbrage with there being changes in a remake that I may or may not be a fan of. I don't think you have to let what has changed and been updated about the lore in this remake trilogy affect your experience or perception of the original. I think you can still just take that as it is. Whereas with this remake trilogy, you can also kind of do that, but it's also like inherently tied to the original game in some ways as well, and your expectations of how things will play out. A lot of the time, my enjoyment of certain moments in this game stemmed from my past experience with the original FF7. With that said, I would really like to be able to replay Remake and Rebirth leading up to Part 3's release. Even if Part 3 isn't day and date on PC, we can kind of assume that it'll be within a year of its PS5 release. Of course, the next Final Fantasy that I have yet to delve into would be Final Fantasy XII, and if I play through that and I feel like I have enough to speak on for it to warrant a video, I will plan to do that. That didn't quite come to fruition with 10-2 because I was not super into that game, even though I did play it all the way through. But yeah, go ahead and let me know what you guys think about Final Fantasy VII Rebirth and or Remake. I'd be happy to discuss that with you guys civilly down in the comments below. I of course want to thank my channel members and shout out Space Cowboy EXE at the Super Shadow Operative tier. Don't forget to leave a like and subscribe, of course, if you enjoyed, and I will catch you guys in the next video.